This is the Knowledge Graph Insights podcast, episode number 35. With the introduction of semantic web technologies in the early 2000s, the World Wide Web began to look something like a giant database. And with great data comes great responsibility. In response to the needs of data stewards and consumers across science, industry, and technology, the Fair Data Principle, FAIR, was introduced. Tom Plasterer was instrumental in the early efforts to make web data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable.
Welcome to the Knowledge Graph Insights podcast, where experts on knowledge graphs and the semantic web share their wisdom with the digital and business communities. Our mission is to demystify and democratize knowledge graph technology and practices to make the benefits of knowledge graphs and semantic technology accessible to all. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 35 of the Knowledge Graph Insights podcast. I am really delighted today to welcome to the show Tom Plasterer. Tom is the managing director and who leads the Knowledge Graph and fair practices at Exponential Data, which is a company in the Boston area, or he's in the Boston area. So welcome, Tom. Tell the folks a little bit more about what you're up to these days.
Thanks, Larry, and great pleasure to be with you and the audience. So I'm now, just last week, I hit a year at Exponential Data after 12 and a half years at Big Pharma. And so I came over to Exponential Data to lead the knowledge graph and fair data practices, and also to unite with our expertise around artificial intelligence. One of the things that I started to get really excited about with the Knowledge Graph Conference over the last few years was the convergence of these two communities, and really how AI, knowledge graphs, and especially fair data as a way of having curated, trusted data for these applications could be completely synergistic. And so that was really what brought me there. And when I joined, we were around 40 people. As I was leading this practice, we grew to about 240 and were recently acquired by Genpact. And so we're now part of a much bigger organization, bringing our strength of artificial intelligence, generative AI, and knowledge graphs and fair data to this larger organization. So that's been really my journey over the last year, and really wanted to bring these two technologies together. And one of the things that we really found is how important fair data is to both sides of the equation. And so this is really where trusted data, clean data, data that follows standards, data that's self-describing, all of the things that you want to do for fair data are really important foundationally for what you want to do with knowledge graphs, and for how you want to give this trusted data to large language models, generative AI, to get the most out of those technologies. So in a nutshell, that's been my journey over the last year.
Yeah. And, we didn't talk explicitly about it as we were preparing for this, but AI is the logical, obvious place where all this is going now. And I think everybody's concerned about delivering trustworthy, clean, fair data, wherever you are. But do you feel like, have you been uniquely well prepared for that with both your company? And I know your background, that's what we want to talk about today, is the kind of the origins of the fair data standard. And you've been around it like right from the get-go, right?
Right from the beginning. And it's the community leans a lot on earlier trends around the semantic web technology. I think a lot of the founders are very web-centric in their thinking. And there's a direct tie between, what Tim Berners-Lee, Aurel Asel, Jim Handler wanted to accomplish with the semantic web, how the standards evolved there, and then kind of grew up and became available within graph databases, eventually knowledge graphs, as a vehicle to prove that fair data worked. And so that's a direct thread between that and wanting to have knowledge injection for generative AI and the value there. The whole thing flows really, really well.
Yeah, interesting. And one thing, as you said that the direct descendants from Tim Berners-Lee's and Aura and Jim's, I guess the paper in Scientific American, one of the things that arose, like, I don't know, 5 or 10 years after that, was Tim Berners-Lee's notion of 5-star data, like the kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-star rating. And then only 7 years later, FAIR came along. Can you talk a little bit about how these perceptions of and the sort of the way good data and their practices are codified?
Sure. So if we think about 5-star linked data and kind of what Tim was trying to accomplish there. Get your data on the web, have it in an accessible format, follow standards, have it linked together. That's really, really close to the fair data principles itself. And I think a lot of the things within the fair data principles were learned directly from that. And I guess first I should take a step back and sort of explain, people have probably come across the fair data principles and they've heard findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. And they think there's 4 of them. There's 15 of them. And so this is where it gets to be a little bit more complicated. So FAIR as an acronym was just a very nice way of sort of marketing and putting these things together. But a lot of the ways that they can become really useful is the sub-principles. So I'm just going to talk about them, describe them real briefly without being too technical. People can learn more about it in the 2016 Nature Medicine paper. So the findable is really about URIs. And so it's really about, can I identify both an instance of data or a concept, a class that follows a URI, later an IRI, and sometimes we're pulling them persistent identifiers or GUPRIs, so global unique persistent resource identifiers, all the same thing. So can you use that to identify a piece of data? And if so, when you resolve it, will it provide useful metadata for both humans and machines? That's really the most important piece that you need to do to get started. Let's put an identifier on our data, on our metadata, so that we can resolve it, find it, put it in an index so we can get something useful out of it. So that's about 4 of the F principles there. Accessible, it's really about interoperability. It's following common protocols. So HTTP, HTTPS, we're not reinventing protocols, we're following standards. And then authentication on top of that in some sort of a certified manner. Usually it ends up being, LDAP with single sign-on or something like that, some way of authenticating your data. And accessible becomes really important because it's what makes the distinction between open data and fair data. Fair is not necessarily open. You're going to have times where you're going to have data that needs to be protected, whether it's things like patient data, medical records, or even licensed commercial content. So one of the ways that the FAIR community was able to get the publishers such as Elsevier on board was to say, we're not going to make your data open, we're going to make it accessible. And so this is, one of the reasons why the publishers, like Elsevier, like Nature, became early proponents of FAIR data. So interoperable, it's really about the vocabularies and the knowledge exchange format. So you need to have one. If it's standards-based, even better. And if your vocabularies are something that's themselves also fair, so they point to each other, they take advantage of each other, that becomes a really powerful way to inject the semantics into your data. So where you get all of the self-describing things that you want out of this data set by having interoperable, fair vocabularies. And this could be an ontology. It could be, a taxonomy, using something like SCOAS. This is also where potentially you want to bring in your rule systems like Shackle. So they're going to really help with interoperability. Reusability, the last one, is really about bringing the first 3 together, making sure that you're following any licensing and access rights on top of this, following whatever community standards are needed, and then detailed provenance lineage tracking. So again, it's a lot more than what's just in the 5-star linked data, but everything 5-star linked data is deeply embedded within FAIR.
That's really interesting. I've read that list a dozen times and everything you just said makes perfect sense, but I'm realizing that FAIR, it worked really well as a marketing thing because people get that. But what are the details for somebody who's who's onboarding to a no job where they haven't worked with fair data or haven't had to comply with the fair data standard before? How do you how important is it to dive that, because that additional level of depth you just provided, that's not a huge deep dive, but it seems really important to really have a handle on the details of each of those letters in the acronym.
Yeah, I think that's been one of the real challenges with fair data and with fair data adoption. So the paper itself describes the fair data principles. It doesn't describe an implementation pattern. And so that was deliberate, and that was done because many of the early practitioners coming out of a predecessor project, there was an IMI OpenFacts was a predecessor project where we kind of learned how to take common bioinformatics, cheminformatic data sources and fold them together in a knowledge graph and come up with some reusable patterns. That one was a project led to the birth of fair data. We can talk about that a little bit more if you want. There was one implementation pattern that was done there, which was basically, have a knowledge graph underneath it, constrain it with APIs, and then provide that as a service. That implementation pattern was not prescribed within the paper. We wanted deliberately multiple implementation patterns to happen so that we weren't telling people, you have to follow FAIR principles, which everybody's going to agree to. I mean, they're going to look at these and go, oh, yeah, these are just common, good ways of codifying data on the web. It's kind of a direct lineage from what you would expect from linked open data. So I don't think there would be much, controversy there. But once you start getting to implementation patterns, right away, people are going to go, well, can I use my relational database for this? Does it have to be a knowledge graph? And so rather than really wanting to force a choice about, making somebody have to put everything into a knowledge graph or a graph database, I think we really wanted the community to experiment for a while. That happened. And then eventually there were FAIR implementation patterns that were developed. I think more often than not, they have at least some linked data component to them. And there are certain standards that we see all the time. So for example, DCAT is a way of describing data catalogs at the level of, I have a file, I verified it, I want to make sure that this is something that I can find again and that I can manage all of the metadata around access to this particular file. Everybody uses DCAT. We've combined around a couple of URI patterns that are pretty powerful. So, but that wasn't the intent. So this is, I'm going a little bit far afield from your question, Larry, but maybe I'll let you reel me back in for a second.
No. What I was going to say, but it's still super interesting to me because I've done like kind of systems, more like design systems in enterprises and stuff like that, and seen other things like that where, they often fail because you specify an implementation. So that the fact that you anticipated that and did not do it, do you think that led to the success of because it seems like quite a successful standard at this point. Do you think that's part of its success?
So I think it's been both a curse and a blessing. So on the one hand, it did allow for multiple different implementation patterns to happen. And so some of them, went pretty far in particular academic circles, which was, also one of the real drivers for FAIR to be born. Government funding agencies wanted a way to show at the end of a project, especially some of these big, systems biology projects with omics data, a way of sharing that data back with the public. So as a repository for this public information, FAIR was really helpful there. So then in some ways, there was a really good implementation pattern that happened within those communities, especially within Europe, but it didn't necessarily translate either to commercial entities or across the Atlantic. And so there were lots of different ways that we could do FAIR, and there still are lots of different ways that you could do FAIR. And so I think now it's later as we've developed a small number of implementation patterns, really headed by groups like the GoFair organization, headed out of the Netherlands, that kind of brought a lot of this together and have really shown the value of collapsing in a couple of powerful implementation patterns.
Yeah. So are there, you mentioned the GoFair initiative in the Netherlands. Are there others like that, or is that sort of a model, or is it just an exemplar of that category of sort of, that's kind of like the meta implementation, like the support for implementations of it? Is that?
So that's certainly one of the major organizations in the FAIR data community. Some of the other ones that I've had the pleasure of being part of are things like the Pistoia Alliance, which is a pre-competitive consortium, primarily within the pharma and biotech space, and it's both in Europe and the US. And along with a couple of like-minded colleagues, we were able to start a FAIR implementation team within the Pistoia Alliance, which has led to things like the FAIR Data Cookbook and a couple of other projects coming out of Pistoia. But we do work closely with groups like GoFair and some of the other FAIR organizations to really kind of evangelize, show these common implementation patterns. So, for example, one of the projects that we're involved with right now is this idea of a pharma general ontology. And so here it takes as a basis that companies are heading and have FAIR data ambitions, but what they really want to do is make their data interoperable within the company and then potentially outside of the company, then also to vendors in this space, CROs in this space. So what Pharma General Ontology, or PGO, attempts to do is find some common vocabularies and some common definitions for things in the life science space that we care about so that we can agree on them. So to give you one example, there's a disease ontology called Mondo that is a very comprehensive cross-map disease ontology covering ICD-9 code, MESH, MEDRA, human disease ethology, many others. Because they've already done this work in this community, basically what we have to do is say, all right, is this fit for purpose for how we're thinking about describing the concept of a disease or to a lesser extent related indication? And so those sort of ideas of let's find those common vocabularies that can be used broadly now mean if we're exchanging data within this consortium or across the consortium, or we're trying to get vendors to follow certain standards, rather than, saying pick one standard out of the, 4,000 or so plus that are used in our space, here's one that we agree on that I think most people are going to drive toward. And that also helps with the whole idea of building consensus around implementation patterns.
Yeah, well, because when you mentioned the fact that the PGO is designed both for internal use and industry use, that I know this can be dicey, but like the political issues around that, were they significant, or is it just kind of I assume it's a little bit of a known issue in any standards thing that you're going to hit those concerns, like enterprise concerns versus industry concerns. But how did that manifest in the birth of FAIR?
So I think we were fortunate that there were a lot of people within sort of the scientific knowledge management community, the systems biology community, that really did want to come together and share their data, make their data interoperable, do it for public health reasons. Yeah, I think there's a really similar cultural aspect between that and the knowledge graph community, especially since there's so many people that participate in both. So we know there's going to be disagreement. We know that top-down is not necessarily going to work. So this is one place where, you do have some top-down coming from standards agencies, ISO in particular. So you have to figure out how to make your internal concepts, whether it's within a company, within a group within a company, say research versus commercial. So you do have to figure out where do you have your points of consensus and your points of commonality, and then where do you have your points of disagreement? And how can you build a structure that lets you work really well and really seamlessly within that structure? Well, this is something within knowledge graphs is pretty easy, right? So we think about layering, we think about different namespaces, we think about when we want these things to come together, we think about building off of definitions that are agreed to in the public space. It's the same thing for the FAIR community. So you just kind of pick those definitions, and you don't have to agree everywhere. You have to agree when you have points of intersection.
Mm-hmm. That reminds me, kind of back to the start of this, you talked about the overlap in like old school RDF knowledge graph people and this alliance. Is that just, it sounds, as you're talking now, I'm like, well, duh. That just seems like you said there's first a lot of overlap, but also like very common concerns in the kind of problems you're addressing. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, I think that's spot on.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting too, because, and that sort of, it doesn't make getting stakeholders to agree on language any easier, but at least the mechanisms by which you ensconce it and all that, that's a little smoother. I guess there's people, well, I guess that's, what percentage of the stuff you dealt with was people stuff, and what percentage was like, I guess people and culture versus like technology and procedures?
Yeah. So I think that's, you're now at a topic layer that's near and dear to my heart. So, I started off, as a scientist, as a systems biologist, as a bioinformatician, and the challenge that I had was all of these massive cross-omics data sets. So it could be genomics or, proteomics or metabolomics or imaging or clinical chemistries, whatever. And I wanted to make sense of them. And so I became a bit of a computer scientist or technologist, after being a biologist first, because I wanted to use graph as a way that made sense to me to be able to bring these things together. And then I've had a chance to see the knowledge graph industry kind of grow up around that idea of using this as a way to serve and solve real deep biological medical problems. So you don't have to go too far when those problems are going to be cultural problems. You're going to have all these disagreements about technology choices. You're going to have, all of these disagreements about how you define things, right? So I think you have to approach this in such a way that why you're here. And the communities that you're trying to build are really about solving big problems, and big problems where you have to kind of approach it with some humility that you're not going to have all the answers. So if you have an approach that's very, very flexible, that lets you build gradually, that lets you not get locked into technology, that's fair. And that's knowledge graph, right? So they kind of go hand in hand.
But that's the way you said that. It makes it's making more and more. Like this made sense to me before we started talking, but it makes more and more sense as you talk about this, especially this kind of like the logical and natural things that arise, and the fact that both people committed to fair principles and like that. That's really interesting. That like was pharma and the life sciences in general, and sort of an ideal proving ground, and that's like, are there things in that part of the academy that lend themselves as well? Did they also fit this little knowledge graph and fair data interest approach?
So then it's an interesting way of looking at it, because I think it was born out of academic systems biology projects in Europe that really wanted a way of serving that data up to the public, or pay for it, after the projects ended. A lot of those same challenges around data stewardship existed within pharma. And so the groups that were there at the beginning of either the OpenFacts projects or the FAIR Plus project, an antecedent project or predecessor project that came around afterward to build the FAIR Cookbook, they're a mix of academics, government agencies, and the FPA 7 pharma partners in Europe. So it's always been kind of that hybrid. And so I think the ideas around data stewardship came out of either academia with government wanting to make sure that the data was served up to the public. But then within industry, we recognized quickly that a lot of these things applied to us. Not everything, because we're not necessarily going to be setting up big data repositories for public consumption. But if we're thinking about things like secondary use of patient data within the understanding of disease space, right? So those sort of things, we're going to need fair data principles for. We're going to need self-organizing, self-describing data that's readable to machines and humans that will allow us to make some decisions on this, both to get the most out of the research that we can, but then also to protect the data as we move along. So yeah, I think that's a natural fit. I think part of the reason that it starts up in research is that's going to be your most collaborative part of the enterprise. I mean, there's certainly some primary research that's going to happen in the pharma setting, but not as much as we can do with partners in the academic setting or the government setting. So because those sort of collaborations are very natural, it made a lot of sense for it to be born there. Now, that said,
Yeah,
I'm seeing it grow elsewhere quite a bit. So that's been one of the revelations of leaving sort of the research setting within a pharma company, is I do get to see it in commercial. I do get to see it in manufacturing. And so I think more and more of these systems, which might have been a little bit more closed because that's just not their culture, are really benefiting from FAIR.
interesting. Yeah, I was talking to a friend the other day about supply, like manufacturing supply chain, not just manufacturing, but like big, electrical grid stuff, and the importance of agreeing on like, how long is that turbine? What's that part? How does it almost seems to me like that would be a stronger case for it, but I don't know all the industry dynamics, but it's interesting. So it kind of started with pharma and the life sciences, and then has it kind of rippled out from there? Is that your sense, or?
I think it's really started to. I think that those, and this is me being relatively new to that part of the industry, they tend to be driven more by a few big tech vendors. They have reasonable starting points for their solution, but they don't necessarily take advantage of the web yet in their thinking. And so it took a long time for a lot of the big tech vendors to really adopt. And this is part of the reason why new players like Google became so dominant, because they were born on the web. And so I think part of that too is, we're now still seeing companies that are adapting to this, that are adapting to their web thinking, that have had a pretty, decent run for a long time by providing good products that were very sort of tailored in scope. They can take advantage of this or not. And if they don't, then, we're perfectly happy in my company to come up with alternate solutions that are fair knowledge graph solutions.
Yeah, that's it. As you talk about that, that's really interesting that like sort of the more native an industry is to web and web ideas, like that notion of sharing in the biological sciences, like versus like, I don't know, Boeing and Airbus probably didn't share a lot of stuff. I don't know if they do to this day, but that those kinds of relationships, is there sort of a predictability about like the age of an industry and its likelihood to adopt fair standards?
Um, I don't know if I would look at it that way. I mean, even for somebody like, Boeing or Airbus, I mean, they're going to have supply chains with a lot of the same suppliers, and the auto manufacturing as well, too. So it's going to behoove these companies to push standards on all of their suppliers. So I think in some ways, they probably are going to be more interoperable than, pharma and medicine. They just might not have thought about it this way. So, yeah, I think in some ways, pharma can lag a bit because there's all of the regulatory requirements that are in place. I think that slows things down quite a bit. I mean, it's still, I think the figures that I've heard most recently are 10 years and $2 billion to get a drug to market. And so, there's been the push for efficiencies in that for an awful long time. And you can do it in the research side early. You can do it in the clinical trial space. There's still a big gulf between adoption for when something is approved and when it penetrates into the market deeply enough and becomes, part of the standard of care. So, I mean, there's a lot of room for improvement in my industry first. And so I think some of the other industries can probably move faster than can take advantage of this too.
That's it. Well, yeah, and that's an interesting thing about pharma is that you just reminded me of like it's pretty much all about like genuine innovation. Like I think some industries are probably optimizing things. I'm just making up macroeconomics in my head here, but one thing I wonder if as I think about the scientific heritage in this, I remember 10 or 15 years ago, I used to go to a lot of like science meetups and stuff when I lived in Seattle. And there was a lot of talk about open science. And I haven't really, and open data. And I know that's become a thing in many government places, especially here in the EU. To what extent, and as you're talking about these commercial entities, like I don't know anything about their, like the practices and standards in industry around things like, people advocating for openness. Was that a big thing in the birth of FAIR? Was just that common desire for openness?
I think there was an awful lot of the people that were pushing for open science, especially on the academic and government side, were there at the beginning. So they were there in the Open Facts Project. They were there in the FAIR Plus projects, the different IMI initiatives that were pushing this in Europe. I think one of the things that happened pretty early on was in order to get industry involved, we had to protect the data rights pretty strongly. So this is where accessibility rather than open became one of the main points. So whether it was, you wanted to have licensed commercial content that was in here, or even if you wanted to have patient records. So you have to have ways of protecting that. So, so this was something where I think the FAIR community has been able to take advantage of a lot of smart work in the ontology community around patient standards, around data access rights, around consent ontology and other places where there's now a standard in place or sets of standards that are emerging that can help with this. So yes, we want open data. Yes, we want to be able to benefit from that, but we also want to protect privacy. So I think it's more important that we have mechanisms in place that we can share when it's possible, both for humans and machines. And if it's not possible, and you need to be able to restrict it and have all of the provenance and audit trail behind it, so you know how it's used.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier that that's built into FAIR. So yeah. Hey, Tom, I can't believe it. We're coming up close to time already, but I feel like we've given this. But before we wrap up, is there anything you'd like to revisit from the conversation, or just make sure we share before we wrap?
Yeah, so I mean, I threw out a couple of teasers early on about generative AI and FAIR and knowledge graphs. And so I would say that is a really interesting space. I think that it's one of those things where we've seen a lot of really good convergence between knowledge graphs and the Gen AI space about how knowledge graphs and ontologies can help constrain some of the things that will happen within your large language model or even your medium-sized language model. That's all really great work. in terms of putting some structure, some more foundation to both the LLMs and the knowledge graphs, that's where FAIR becomes really powerful and really valuable. And there's so much existing work that's in place already around the vocabularies, around ontologies that are commonly used, especially in the biomedical space, and now more and more in the manufacturing space, especially in the life sciences industry. We're not starting from scratch. And so I think, not just thinking about, naively, companies are going to look at it and go, what's your AI strategy, right? And so if you have an AI strategy, you better have a knowledge strategy. If you have a knowledge strategy, you better have a FAIR strategy. So I'm probably out on a limb a little bit on the third part of that pillar, but I think that's where some of this needs to go.
That lines up with a lot of stuff I've been hearing lately. So I think that's quite plausible and really, it makes a lot of sense to me. So that notion from AI to knowledge strategy to you better have your FAIR house in order at the very foundation of it. That's great.
I've got a slide I use all the time, Larry, that's a pyramid with FAIR at the bottom, some sort of a data mesh in the middle, knowledge graph at the top, or knowledge graph assisted AI at the top. So you'll probably come across that on some of my talks.
If you could send me a copy of that, I'll put it in the show notes so people don't have to go digging. Yeah, that'd be great. Well, hey, one very last thing, Tom. If folks would like to connect with you or follow you online, what's the best place to find you?
So LinkedIn's probably the easiest place. So that's T Plasterer is my LinkedIn handle. So just TPLASTERER. Should be able to find me there. We do blogs every once in a while. So that's probably the best place to start.
Okay, yeah, kind of the default place these days. Well, thank you so much, Tom. It was always great to talk, and this was really, we never got to nerd out before on FAIR, so this was really super helpful.
Oh, pleasure was mine, Larry. Thanks for the invitation.
For show notes and to sign up for our newsletter, visit our website at knowledgegraphinsights.com, and please rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you for listening.